Hello and welcome, everyone. It's nice to see a pretty good-sized audience here. Appreciate you spending some time with us. Welcome back to our co-hosted webinars with AVMA Life. We're very happy to be able to continue to offer these webinars. I'm Dr. Anna Brutlog. I'm the Director of Veterinary Services here at Pet Poison Helpline. I'll be your host today. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to turn everything over to AVMA Life, and then we will introduce our speaker du jour, Michael McGuire. So just a few quick items of note today. This webinar is being recorded. So if you think it's really valuable and you want your colleagues to listen to this, because this is going to make a big impression on the way you reach out to millennials in your practice, rest assured you can revisit this webinar. We'll post it on our website tomorrow, and we'll send out a little note with a recording. So it'll be accessible to everyone. Same with CE certificates. So we should be sending out our CE certificates tomorrow late afternoon, so we're Central Time. If you don't receive your CE certificate by Monday, please let us know and we'll make sure and get that to you. Now, just to note, this is not a race-approved webinar, but certainly you are more than welcome to submit the CE certificate to your own jurisdictional educational body. So, just a couple of quick notes about CE certificates as well. If you are watching this presentation in a group, the only person that we can see on our end who's watching this is the person who's signed in. So in order to get CE certificates for everyone else in the group, just make sure that you email us. And this information is also on a slide in the handout, but email us at info@petpoisonhelpline.com and just provide us with the name and the email address of everyone in your group, and we will be sure to email a CE certificate to them as well. So we'll get that all taken care of for you. Now, before we get started with our webinar, I just wanted to say a couple of things. So Michael McGuire, I think you're in for a real treat today. In fact, all of us here at Pet Poison Helpline are very excited about this webinar. I think as not a millennial myself, we're always curious about who these millennials are, and I think we're going to get a pretty good education on that today. Now, as Michael's webinar or his lecture is going to build on itself over time, so I'm going to ask you to hold your questions, unless of course there's something that you really didn't understand and want to ask about. But in general, hold your questions today until the end, because I think a lot of your questions will probably answer themselves as we go through the webinar. But then we're going to have time for questions at the end, and I think that will actually be a pretty valuable time to have some interactive discussion at that point in time. So if you have questions, feel free to write them in the question box. I will be monitoring those as we go along and then selecting questions at the end to ask. And if anything else comes up, you can't see, you can't hear, or something's going on your side technologically, you can certainly shoot us a note in the question box and let us know. So let's get started. Very quickly, I just want to talk about what is Pet Poison Helpline. And you may say, well, Pet Poison Helpline, you're a poison control center. Why are you guys putting on these webinars with AVMA Life? It's a great question. Well, we've had a partnership now with AVMA Life, an educational partnership, to reach out and enhance the lives of veterinarians, the veterinary community as a whole, and we will present on topics that are just a little bit broader than toxicology. And I'll let Libby Wallace talk about that in just a second. But Pet Poison Helpline itself, if you're not familiar, we are a 24/7 animal poison control. We're based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's frigidly cold. It's been a terribly cold winter. So I hope that you are somewhere warmer. Pet Poison Helpline, our expertise, so our veterinary side, we're made up of toxicologists, of course. We also have criticalists and internists on staff. And we're very unique in the fact that we operate a human poison control center side by side. So that's very helpful to someone like me, who as a veterinary toxicologist, when I'm getting a call about a brand new human drug, I have a team of pharmacists that I can talk to as well. So oftentimes we have cases that are really a unique team approach. Our consultation fee is $59, and that includes all follow-up. It includes a copy of, or copies, depending on how many times you call us, of those case notes to be sent to your clinic. And the other thing that we really pride ourselves in at Pet Poison Helpline is being an educational center. Education is within our mission. This is one of the reasons that we do the webinars that we're doing, including this one today. And we also have a host of toxicology-focused tools specifically made for practitioners and technicians. So as you can see a list here, we do send out newsletters that you're welcome to put on your social media sites, your website. So we have a lot of fodder like that also helps educate pet owners. If you're not signed up for those and you would like to receive those, please just send us an email. Again, info@Pet Poison Helpline. You can find our email address later in this webinar and as well on our website. So I wanted to just quickly let everyone know we do have 2 more AVMA Life co-sponsored webinars coming up this year. In fact, I do expect that we'll have another one thrown in too. But our next one is April, and this will be focusing again on mental health and wellness, specifically regarding suicide prevention. We know this has been a big issue, of course, in veterinary medicine, and we're having a physician who specializes in this on the human side, but really looking over all healthcare professions going to be talking about this. And then November 15th, we have a presentation that will be focused on financial wellness. So another focus more for if you're in practice, you're thinking about buying into a practice, or you own a practice and you're looking for some kind of managerial skills to take with you. So more on those coming soon. Watch your email. At this point in time, I'm going to turn things over to Libby Wallace, and she is again with AVMA Life, who is very generously sponsoring these webinars with us. So Libby, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Berlag. You know, this has been a great partnership, and AVMA Life is really excited to be able to bring you this presentation as well as the other quarterly webinars that we host in conjunction with Pet Poison Helpline. It's a great group to work with, and I think we build on each other in that we're both really adamant about servicing and helping veterinarians and the veterinary family when it comes to well-being. And this presentation today, I have heard this before, and I think you're all going to be really engaged. If you, Dr. Anna, if you might want to go to the next slide, I think it kind of summarizes it up, and I don't want to spend too much time on AVMA Life because I want to get to Michael's presentation, but just in case those on the phone don't know, AVMA Life is an insurance trust with the AVMA, but we're more than just that. You know, we have a variety of plans for veterinarians, but also for the staff. So, you know, because we know that the staff is such an important part of the veterinary community, there's dental plans, disability and life insurance plans that are available, in addition to lots of other services that we have, but well-being being one of our primary initiatives. And so this is just kind of a glance at what we do, but obviously there's opportunity to get more information if you're interested. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to introduce Michael McGuire because I think he's got a really fun presentation. I've heard this before, and I always learn something every time I hear it. I've actually worked with Michael, I think since 2014. We started working together with his organization, 88 Brand Partners. And really at that time, what we were experiencing was a change in our business model because the health insurance, as most of you probably know, changed significantly a few years ago. And when we got together with Michael and we said, let's do some research with our members and with our product and see really where our brand needs to be. And so with that, we changed our name to AVMA Life Trust, and I think it really resonates with the membership. So I think a lot of the research that we gained with Michael, both from the AVMA, the AVMA PLIT, and now AVMA Life, really brought us to this point where Michael and his organization were able to get some further research. So without further ado, Michael, I will turn it over to you and tell us about Millennial.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for, I'll echo appreciation for all your time today, smack dab in the middle of the day. I'm really excited to be here. I was talking yesterday with the team, and I believe that we have presented this presentation in the last couple years over 100 times, and I'm happy to hear that this is the second largest group that I will have had an opportunity to present to, so this is exciting for me as well. So today, before we get started, you know, understanding that the topics of webinars that you guys have covered in the past have been very specific to the veterinary practice and your day-to-day lives, and today is going to be a little bit of applied application. There will be no mention of veterinary medicine in the presentation, probably not typical for types of programs like this, but what's really interesting about this is the learnings about how to communicate specifically with a population that is in certain aspects very different than populations that have come before them, is going to be really important, not only in our professional lives, but I've talked to many people who've said, man, oh man, this really helps me explain my niece or nephew, or in some cases my own children, a little bit better. So really excited to present this. A little bit of context as we go through. I am the president and CEO of two organizations, Q&A Group, which is a marketing research firm, and 88 Brand Partners, which is a branding and advertising agency, both headquartered in downtown Chicago. As Libby mentioned, we have worked with a variety of veterinary clients. It's interesting how our type of industry allows us to be able to work in with a lot of different industries, and I kind of feel like we have been adopted into the veterinary community, even though we certainly don't have the educational credentials to practice any sort of medicine. But through the work with Q&A and 88 in partnership with the AVMA, with AVMA Life, AVMA PLIT, with educational programs like Auburn's Veterinary School, as well as the recently renamed International Council of Veterinary Assessment, which is the organization that administers the NAVLE. We have spoken to over 1,000 veterinarians in our since the ongoing of the relationship in 2013. So we know veterinary medicine quite well. And what's interesting about this presentation, as I've presented this through a lot of veterinary conferences, is how people tend to compare, specifically as practice owners or even as individuals, the mainstream millennial versus the millennial in the veterinary profession. And the first thing that I'll start out by saying is you all feel it every day that this profession has a wealth of individuals who are very passionate about the work that they do. And so this is also an interesting time to point out that this body of work is really intended to give you a basis, but should not be necessarily tethered to a specific individual. We're going to be looking at the millennial population as a whole. We started this journey by really being challenged with a lot of conversations we were having with our clients. Our client portfolio is exclusively service-related brands. So when you think of advertising, you think of moving toothpaste or mac and cheese off of a shelf. We don't do any of that work. We do work for hospitals and healthcare, for financial services, for education, for associations. They're experiences that you can't hold in your hand. And you're really needing to create opportunity to create loyalty and deepening affinity with organizations. And we see that very much in alignment with work that veterinarians do with building that relationship or that experience or that service with their clientele. And so it was probably 2014, 2015, where we kept seeing this millennial thing coming up. Now, I'll acknowledge, as we celebrated New Year's this year and saw the calendar click over to 2018, having a conversation about millennials in 2018 probably had some people rolling their eyes like, oh, 10 years ago we were talking about this. In fact, in 2007, late 2007, early 2008 is really when the terminology of millennials kind of really came into dialogue, specifically in our industry, primarily relating to fashion and technology brands. They were kind of the first adopters to really understand that there's a different way of talking to this audience. And then very quickly thereafter, it was followed up with our counterparts in HR and providing perspective on how employers interact with millennials. And we have a little bit of that peppered through, and if some questions at the end come up about that, I've got some interesting information. But the first thing that we did is I went out and I started talking to our clients, and I was asking them some very specific questions. What are your strategies to talking to millennials? And I was meeting with the telecom CEO of some work that we do, and I said, so, Bill, tell me about, what is your strategy for marketing to millennials? And he went, oh, they're like aliens to me. The only strategy I have, I guess, is figuring out the best way to market to boomers like me and just do the exact opposite. And as much as I tell that story, I kind of get chuckles from the room. He was not laughing. That was his strategy. He really saw it as being completely counter to a point of view that he had, and it was rudderless. our conversations were not unique in that sense. There were a lot of people who were saying, I'm really kind of stuck and I don't know what to do. So we started looking at the base of research that exists out there on millennials at the time. It's worth mentioning this is a 3-year study that kicked off in 2016. You'll see data about that today. A dimension of it was added in 2017, and the 2018 study comes out of market in April. So it's the cap off of a 3-year millennial study. The first year giving us a basis to understand millennials' relationship with service brands, and we'll talk about a lot about that today. The second year talking about greater good and millennials' relationship to the world as a whole. And the third year is talking about millennials and tribes, how they choose to align themselves with one another and how they choose to align themselves with organizations and brands. And the first thing that we did in 2016 was look at all of the research that existed and also the press that was talking about millennials. And we noticed a trend that was coming up. We were seeing things like entitled, lazy, greedy, spoiled, impatient. There's a great SNL sketch where the actors are talking about they're millennials and they're playing and they're all on their cell phones and they're not engaged and looking at each other. And all of a sudden you hear this scream and you look over and you see that one of the millennials is looking out the window as though one of his colleagues has jumped out the window. And what you realize as the sketch goes on is it's the person's cell phone that accidentally was dropped out the window, and everybody's reacting very dramatically to the fact that this person lost their cell phone. Certainly that's in humor and supposed to kind of dramatize what's happening through satire. But the reality was that there was clearly some assumptions that were being made, and we wanted to first affirm whether or not that was the case. I mentioned this before. We are going to be talking about data, and the data certainly is driving the conversation. You may say, I absolutely disagree with this data point. I have a nephew who's a really successful lawyer, and he doesn't act like that at all. Individuals may act differently than the data that's being shared. However, people as a whole are fairly predictable. It's the reason why so much of work that's done in statistical work relating to marketing is the basis of so much of our strategies being put together. People in general are fairly predictable if you take the time to figure out the right questions to ask, and that was kind of our challenge coming into this. So the first thing I want to do is define who they are, because these titles and terms kind of get rolled out, and I first have to defer to the great work of kind of the guru from a terms of research standpoint that kind of sets these terms, and that's Pew Research, and I'm sure many of you know that name. Pew is an international research organization. They're very large, and they are the ones that are really looked to define how demographic groups are broken down and ultimately labeled. There is a lot of information, and I get really geeked out about this, so I spend more time learning and exploring this topic. We won't spend too much time today, but Pew has identified different demographic groups, and these are the three that we're going to be focusing on today. Millennials being born between 82 and 2000, it's about 75 million. Their ages fall generally within this area. It's interesting. There's a lot of great research out there about this topic. And if you fall at the earlier side or later side of any of these generational groups, you're considered a cusper. So you can have millennial views and Generation X views if you kind of fall within this 35, 36, 37 kind of realm. So these are not hard numbers but they're meant to kind of directionally let you know. Gen X ages now roughly 37 to 53, and then the boomers 54 on roughly. Just one other thing to point out on here, two more points. One, the Gen X population, I will admit to falling pretty nicely not only into the demographic profile of a Gen Xer, but certainly the attitudinal profile of a Gen Xer, and we'll talk about that in a little while. They often are being talked about as though they're the smallest group generationally. The reason why that is simply because the span of time that is being defined as a Gen Xer is smaller than the other groups. So it's not as though that was any less significant. It just means that that's how that's capped. So a question often is asked of me, how do they come up with these dates? Again, there's a lot of information out there, but Pew defines it as being critical moments in society where an individual's perception of themselves and the world as a whole shifts. September 11th was a big point. So you see that 2000, 2001 period as being a pretty pivotal point for those people who are millennials, who experienced in their formative years change in society that has marked a shift in their view towards society and society's institutions. And you'll see that can often be affected by financial crisis or global events like war. But again, these things kind of frame out when there are specific shifts that are happening. Over time, demographic groups firm up. And you'll probably hear terms tossed around like Gen Y was a big one, and now we're getting into Gen Z, and everybody's trying to figure out what like the next thing is going to be. The reason why Gen Y is not used anymore is as the demographic group hits its end point, its cap point, and they bookend the demographic, like with millennials, the new demographic group then will pick up now at ages 17, but it hasn't ended. Pew has not defined the end book point of the group before. So something like Gen Z is often used to define the period following the millennial group, but it hasn't ended yet. And they might define Gen Z as a period of time, but that demographic might go longer attitudinally before they put the cap on it. And when they put the cap on it, often those kind of demographic groups kind of fall away. So when looking at the conventional understanding of demographic breakdown from 82 onward, 2000 onward, we're able to really zero in on 3 demographic groups, and those are millennials, Gen Xers, and boomers. So a little bit about our study. We conducted 3 national surveys. These were conducted online with just shy of 1,500 consumers, ages 18 through 70. The first, if you're very perceptive, you will have noticed that our millennial group was younger than what we sampled here. And the reason why is because we're talking about a lot of things today, because the demographic groups gets into when kids are often influenced by their parents. We wanted to make sure that we were talking to people who at least were far enough in their lives that they were at least thinking about making decisions on their own. So that's why we capped it at 18 to 70. We had a hypothesis going into this that we wanted to have a conversation not only about these groups, but also to understand if there was a difference between younger millennials and older millennials. And you'll see the 31 and 34. We tended to oversample in those areas because we wanted to understand if a younger millennial had the same perceptions of society relating to service-related organizations as their older counterparts. Sometimes in our line of business, those hypotheses don't bear out, and this is one of them. There was little significance. In fact, not enough significance statistically to really see a large enough difference in any of the data that we're preparing today between younger and older millennials. So we appropriately adapted the data to make sure that the weighting was appropriate. So what you're seeing today is equal weighting of millennials, boomers, and Xers equally. So we can make the inferences accurately. The population sizes were large enough for us to make the inferences that we're going to be talking about today. It was also very interesting, and we conducted our first one in April of 2016. We had several sessions throughout 2016 here in Chicago, where we took this research and we sat back down with millennials and we said, okay, here's what the research told us. Does this sound right? And if it does, let us know, and where it doesn't, let us know. And also give us any stories. And so today I'm going to pepper through some of the conversations that we've had. Certainly, as I mentioned, since early 2016, I've had an opportunity to present this all over to a variety of audiences. And it's at this point in time that I always acknowledge that we talk about millennials, and more times than not, I've got millennials listening to the conversation. So hello, millennials out there. We're going to talk about you guys like your elephants at the zoo, but the reality is that none of this is meant to be disparaging at all. In fact, with giving you the end chapter in the book, we're going to find out that the picture that the press painted at the beginning is probably not a fair representation, and we come to uncover what is the true representation we believe of millennials, and both what we saw in this qualitative sessions as well as conversations during presentations is that we found that millennials see this as a pretty accurate reflection of how they feel. So millennials, I hear you out there. So the first place we're going to understand is kind of how they think. Where are their traits and attitudes aligned with their other demographic groups, and where are they different? So what we did is we asked respondents, we gave them a number of traits, and we said, in your own self-assessment of you, define the traits up here that you believe most define who you are. We left it pretty open, but this is self-reflection, self-reporting back. The first thing that we found out is, when looking at Xers, Boomers, and Millennials, we found that these 5 traits were shared by all of them. So the first item of agreement across the board was that all 3 groups saw these as 5 traits that reflected who they are. And that's adaptable, social, open-minded, socially aware, and multitasking. We did not define these terms at all. We simply put the terms up there and allowed them to do their own association with what these terms meant and what it meant to them. We have spent a lot of time unpacking this, and as you can imagine, in an hour-long conversation, as I keep looking at my clock to make sure I'm clipping along, there's a lot more data than we're able to show today. And there is more data behind all of this. But what we've discovered is that these 5 traits we would define as 5 traits that make you a functioning individual in society. If you're not social, adaptable, open-minded, socially aware, and have an ability to multitask, you're probably not going to be able to maneuver through society as easily as other individuals in your community. And so it seems to us, and certainly in conversations, that it seems fairly correct that these would be the 5 traits that would be shared. But there are traits that are unique to specific groups, and we'll start with our first, which is our millennials. In addition to these 5 traits, they have identified an additional 5. This is statistically significant, so this is not just a handful. This is collectively as a group, the numbers show us that there is significant pop with these additional 5 traits: fun, creative, ambitious, modern, and sarcastic. We get to sarcastic, and there typically is another chuckle in the room. Sarcasm is not a negative term to millennials. They see it as when we've asked them, how do you identify sarcasm? They look at it as the realistic way of talking about a situation or an event, and it just kind of is what it is. And it is sometimes crass, and it sometimes isn't positive, but it's the reality of what's kind of happening. Modern, fun, creative, ambitious, along with the additional societal navigating traits. Xers, trusting, simplified, hardworking, and successful. 4 popped for them. When I think about my life right now and where I am in my career and my family and such, trusting, simplified, successful, and hardworking are traits that I believe very much align with kind of my thinking, and certainly have proven to be the case in conversations that we've had with other Xers. And our Boomer counterparts, they have 7: realistic, real, not fake, ethical, authentic, charitable, cautious, and patriotic. I'll pull out a couple of these. I'll start with this story that's my own. My father, who is a Boomer, a number of years ago found one brand of pair of shoes. Right now, they do not sell them in stores. You can only get them on Amazon. And when he wears out those shoes, he goes onto Amazon and has the next pair, the same size, same color, same brand scent. And I keep saying to my father, it's time to find a new style of shoes. And he's like, nope, these are the shoes that I like. These are the shoes that I've tried out. They don't look so great, but they feel good. I know what I'm getting, and that's what I'm dealing with. He's very realistic. He's been through it. He's not fake. He doesn't need to put up airs. It's just authentically who he is. I think that characteristics on here, charitable and patriotic, are things that have often been described as being things that as your life gains perspective, you understand the importance of being more charitable and the importance of patriotism. I think boomers also have the unique experiences of having been informed by the generations before them that very much placed high value on patriotism. And there's a lot of information out there about how patriotism is measured and shifts in views of patriotism in light of globalization and a lot of other factors. So if you're interested in that, there's a wealth of information out there. The last is cautious, and we didn't know kind of how to interpret that, but cautious is really a reflection of 2 points. One, an understanding that your bodies are just not what they once were. And so as much as the desire might be to go down the Black Diamond Hill at Whistler, the reality is maybe they should be a little bit more cautious. And also cautiousness when it comes to spending. They actually really at the forefront of their thinking are thinking about retirement and the quality of life that they want to have after their professional career if that's not happened yet. And so being much more cautious with their spending. It's the reason why my father would not spend anything more for something as silly as more expensive, more stylish shoes when he can get something that he knows and is familiar with and save that money. So all of these things kind of balance in. What's interesting when you look at all of these traits collectively is the fact that for those of you who are boomers out there, you have the benefit of thinking about your life in a much longer way. But if you go back to the traits relating to millennials and Xers and boomers, if I can ask you to reflect millennials, we'll get to you in a second. I can see that when I was a millennial-aged person, when I was post grade school, starting college in that area, I was fun, I was creative, I was ambitious, I was modern, and I was fairly sarcastic, at least that's what my mother tells me. And as I evolve into a midlife sort of place, I'm more trusting and simplified and successful and hardworking. And what we find in terms of this type of work is when we talk about life stages, that's probably a better term than a demographic label. Millennials, you will have that term tied with you forever. The good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it, is your life will soon be trusting, simplified, successful, and hardworking. So have fun and be sarcastic now. And Xers out there, we will graciously move into a more realistic, charitable, potentially patriotic, potentially cautious, authentic way of viewing the world when we're boomers. So the advice that I had to Bill at the telecom company was when you kind of figure out what you want to do with millennials, and if you're not willing to put together research and strategies to reach out to them, when you're thinking about how to market with them, at least put on music on headphones that you listen to when you're that age and channel your younger self. That at its baseline will at least get you thinking about how the world was back when you were a millennial. We next asked a series of questions about individuals' association with societal institutions. And I'm very careful when we get to this point to make it very clear that when you do work in research, the numbers guide the conversation. So I will point out when there are discrepancies in the numbers from study to study, and there's one that's coming up in a section in a second. But we are making in no way any judgment about a political landscape or anything relating to religion or anything like that, though we will be talking about those institutions as a whole. We asked them their perceptions on each one of these things to understand whether or not cynicism, which is the defining term that's used in PR and press to define millennials, that they're just cynical, is truly a category defining term to use for millennials. And so we wanted to know how millennials view different societal institutions. Certainly those things based on business. So we've got some questions in there about government, about corporations, about religion, and then 2, just because it's the work that we do, about advertising and communications. Is advertising a good way to learn about products and services, and whether or not they believe in the truthfulness of advertising? And so there were a series of questions. These were statements that were included in this section. We were able to do a research technique that allowed us to be able to do some cluster analysis and align responses to different ways of answering this question on scale ratings. And what we were able to do is develop what we refer to as the cynicism scale. And we were able to determine whether or not millennials tend to be more cynical in their view of societal institutions than their demographic counterparts. And so I wanted to define the 4 segments that make up our cynicism scale. First is our skeptical cynics. These are our hardcore cynics. These are people who really didn't view business as positive and really kind of felt like it only rewarded individuals. They were critical of government's efficiency. They had a negative view of religion, and they really were cynical about advertising, both in its truthfulness and its utility. This is one of those questions that we are excited to explore in the next study that's coming out. We didn't ask these lines of questions in last year's study. There were just other things that we wanted to find. So in a 3-year period, it's going to be interesting to see how cynicism has changed. This is a dimension that we're very excited to hear about. The next cynicism group that we looked at are called guarded realists. These are people that kind of tend to be a little bit more middle of the road. They're a little bit more balanced in their views. They do have a slightly more modest view of the role of business in success of the country, but they tend to be much more guarded on performance of the government and religion. And they do have some skepticism about advertising and its truthfulness. They get that it's there and it has its importance, but they don't really always take everything hook, line, and sinker as it relates to being truthful. Our next group is hopeful idealists. These are cautious optimists. It's kind of the 2 coins. They really generally feel positive about societal institutions. They hold positive views about business, mostly positive about religion. And they see an importance in advertising, but again, they wouldn't necessarily say that they're skeptical of the truthfulness of advertising. They just need to be on guard. If anything, there was a respondent that said, if anything seems to be too untrue, too good to be real, it probably is. So that's kind of this hopeful idealists group. And true believers, if you guys have seen the movie Ferdinand, that's out in movies right now. I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. I was there this weekend. This is the Ferdinand group. In general, they are the least cynical. They have relatively strong views on business and religion, favorable views about the government's performance, and they do view advertising as being valuable and generally, more times than not, truthful. And so these are people that are the least cynical in terms of our cynicism scale. So before, where we were talking about traits, we started with millennials. We're going to start with our boomer segment now. And we just pulled out the boomer segment, and we mapped them on this cynicism scale. And what we found out is that for the most part, our boomer segment fell a third in our less cynical end of our scale. So true believers at about 31, 33, and 31. So what we're finding is these people in general tend to be fairly non-cynical. You'll see this 5% that exists out there, so it's not as though there aren't those that are outlying, but that there's where we're at. When we compare boomers then to Xers, we're starting to see the scale get shift over more to cynicism. So you fall more so in the guarded realist, hopeful idealist section, so kind of that midlife. Now when we look at millennials, we were really excited to see this the first time that we looked at the data, because we were ready to see that red line pop up. The reality is we did see it happen, but not to the extent that we thought it would. It only went up to 10%. We did see the guarded realists being higher, and was the highest percentile of any of the groups that we've seen. what it leads us to believe is we believe that the press specifically has painted a picture that has taken millennials one step further than how they truly are. A better term to define millennials' views to society is that they're just realists. It just is what it is, the good, the bad. It ties back to that first trend that we saw in terms of self-identification of cynicism, sarcasm. It's not viewed as bad. Being a realist isn't bad. They see cynicism as now falling into that's kind of negative. That's kind of heading in that direction. But realists, guarded realists, are a much better place for them to live. So it's a better term to think about these individuals as realists and not cynics. So we're going to talk about buy, and it's more about choice than it is about buying. But what we wanted to do is create some scenarios in which we shared real-life experiences about different decisions that individuals would make and asked them to choose which one of the options that might be presented would be the most appealing. And then what we asked them to do is break them down by the features of each one of those options to talk about pros and cons. It'll make sense in a second. This is the point in time in which I'm going to ask everybody who's listening out there to perk up a little bit, because we're going to have some polling questions and some audience interaction. So we asked individuals to think about three different purchasing scenarios. One, purchasing eyeglasses, securing a credit card, and identifying a health plan. We wanted to choose decisions that are not decisions that are made hastily in many situations, and they're going to be decisions that have impact over a period of time. So it's not a pack of gum that if I don't like it, I'm going to throw it away. And it's something that I don't oftentimes make an impulse buy towards. These are things that tend to be a little bit more thought out. And we asked them within each one of these scenarios which they would prefer of three different options. So for eyeglasses, we presented three different options. In option A, it's an online retailer that allows you to, quote, try on the glasses online. So you can use your webcam and you can literally put glasses on a picture of your face to see what frames might look good. Out of the options here, it's the largest selection. There's free shipping and returns and replacements. And we also threw in a buy one, give one program, kind of like what Bonobos does, where if you buy an item, a pair of glasses, they will give a pair of glasses to somebody who is in an underserved, underprivileged area. So that's option A. Take notes, you're going to have to choose one of these three for the poll that's going to come up in a second. Option B is locally owned and operated shops within the neighborhood, kind of a mom and pop environment, personalized service and attention. And the benefit is that you can go in there and receive fitting and measurements performed by technicians that have a lot of experience doing that type of work. And then option C, a national chain of optical shops, think Lens Crafters, with locations throughout the area and across the country. So there's certainly availability. And has as part of it promotions that regularly are offered at like buy one, get one half price. So a promotionally driven sort of organization. So these are your three options, and somehow through the magic of technology, it's going to open up and make it obvious for each one of you to choose option A, which is your online resource with those others, option B, which is your mom and pop local, and C, which is your national chain.
Okay, excellent. So I'm seeing responses roll in here, Michael. Let's give everyone a few seconds to finish up, and then I will show the results. So, all right, everyone, finish up in 3, 2, 1.
So it looks like how these things are falling is about half of the people chose option B, and then the other roughly quarter are on A and C. Let me see if I can get my presentation back.
Okay.
So, are we good? Yeah. What we found is that option B, so nicely done, was preferred by most millennials. One of the things that we found out was as much as we are seeing the press portray millennials as being aloof and non-communicative, millennials are well aware of the information they know, and then what they're not experts at. And what millennials often say is, if I'm going to spend money on glasses and it defines kind of who I am in terms of my look, I want to make sure that they fit, and I want to be able to hold them in my hand. And I like feeling like I'm making an impact in my community and supporting small business. And all of this was really, really important to them. And so collectively, millennials gravitated towards option B as their preferred option. It's interesting. This is one of the few groups, you're smarter than the average bear out there, because most people logically think that because it's an online retailer that lets you try on the largest selection and all this stuff, that millennials are going to go there because they're constantly on their cell phones. We'll talk about cell phones in a second. What's interesting about this, when we started looking at the specific features, is what is actually appealing to the millennials was the fact that you can go online at any point in time. So the only frustration that came out in option B was the idea of I have to shop between hours that are established. The ideal situation was option B that was open 24 hours a day, which we know from a practicality standpoint is not possible. But it really wasn't selection, and it really wasn't greater good in the buy one, give one. It was really about access. The next is credit cards, and nothing is more daunting than presenting this presentation to organizations like Discover Card and American Express, but we have. And they have scores of this information, and I always get to this slide and go, oh, I hope I'm not skewered. And of course, they do a lot of work in this area, and I generally get nods up and down. So that was the affirmation that I needed. So the option A, B, and C, and I'm going to ask you to kind of stay with me for a second because we're going to throw some numbers out. But option A has a higher interest rate where B and C are kind of locked in at 18.75. So option A has the higher interest rate. Option B has the lower cash back on purchases. And the third feature before we start to get to other features is that option A has no annual fee. So when you start looking at option A, it's got the highest interest rate, has between the options the higher cashback bonus and no annual fee. They also have some additional features. They have a members points program with Amazon where a certain number of dollars that is spent equates to points that can be applied to buying or to securing goods on Amazon, and also a fairly robust mobile app as part of option A. Option B, an 18.75 interest rate, so the lower interest rate, lower cash back, and a $50 annual fee. And we put a greater good idea in here. So really, this is an option where the organization supports financial literacy programs in low-income populations. And then option C, the lower interest rate, the higher cash back, the annual fee of $50, and then another rewards program that's not as defined as the Amazon in terms of logic, but this whole dollar spent equates to 10 points. So something that was a little bit more tangible and transactional in option C. Okay, we're getting ready for poll 2. Option A, option B, or option C? The numbers are, I feel like, are on the Price is Right.
I think this is great, Michael. Very interesting.
Okay, great. We'll lock it in there because, again, I'm going to give high scores to this group. If we go back to our options, what you'll find is that option A indeed is the one that millennials preferred. And this was a stumper for me at first because I just couldn't get past it. Why they would opt for a higher interest rate. And they quickly directed me to the third point on there, which is the no annual fee. Millennials were baffled by this point. They did not understand why I would have to pay a fee to spend my own money. It was just more than what they could even get past to talk about many other features. They see an interest rate being associated with behavior that I've chosen to do. So if I decide to use my credit card irresponsibly, then a higher interest rate, that is kind of the consequences for my actions. Relists, they're relists. But I don't want to be faulted to use the card which benefits you to have access to my money. On top of that, when I have an ability to be able to make more money in terms of my cash back, people were much more interested in using that card. So the idea of this is I don't want to be penalized, and if you can help me in a higher way in terms of cash back, get things back, that's even better. There were features in option B that were very appealing to them, specifically the last point, supporting financial literacy programs in low-income populations. Actually, the whole statement wasn't true. It's actually the first part that was most appealing. What they liked was providing financial literacy programs actually for themselves. We talked about before in the classes that millennials are recognized when they don't know things. They might not act like it if you're a parent, but in reality, there are things that they don't know about. And financial understanding is one of those areas in which most millennials don't feel comfortable. And so if there is a bank or financial institution out there that's providing me a way of being better educated on how to be fiscally responsible, sometimes that flies even at the face of what I believe the bank is out there to do, which is to make money. So you're going to help me learn how to be better so I'm not spending more, which goes potentially against the model of using a bank or using credit. That's really earth-shattering for them. And oftentimes people use financial literacy as a way to create, banks are using financial literacy as a way to create the relationship with individuals who are in middle school and high school to kind of groom that thought of we're here to help you not get into trouble. And that's kind of the trends, one of the trends that are happening in banking. Option 3, we're going to go through pretty quickly because with the changes with the Affordable Care Act and now these millennials being able to stay on their parents' insurance longer, things have kind of shifted. But I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Option A, option B, option C. Option A essentially is the highest premium, encompassing all the doctors, including their current doctors. So it's an open plan. They do have screenings in there and tobacco prevention and child diabetes prevention. Option B, encompassing some of the doctors in an area, so a little bit more closed, including the current doctor, with a medium monthly premium. And option C, encompassing a smaller group of doctors, and your current doctor is not included at $235 per month. They also offer a discount program for gym memberships and I. So we're going to quick do scenario for option 3. Wide network, high cost, mid one, where your doctor is included at a mid cost, and then the lower option. And 3, 2, 1. We have some second guessers out there. The number that was chosen for millennials is actually option A. So what's interesting about that is when we talk to them, their response is, I'm willing to pay more until I figure out what I want to do. I don't want to be restrictive. I'm willing to pay more for services. And there was one young lady that said, I had a dermatology issue, and I went to my friend, and I asked her who her dermatologist was because she had some issues, and they've been resolved. And she told me who it was, and so then I went to that person, and they said, we don't accept your insurance. And she said, I felt betrayed by my insurance policy. They don't want those limitations put on them, and they're willing to pay more for that. In contrast, our boomers tended to gravitate towards option C, and a lot of people were really surprised by this because it doesn't include their current doctor. I think this goes back to that cautious and guarded approach in the trait section, which says there is a significant difference between $235 a month and $350 a month, and that span was large enough to be able to say, you want to know what, as long as there is enough doctors in the area that I have some sort of selection, I don't necessarily need to be paying a higher amount to be able to keep my current doctor. Lots of additional research can be done in that area, but we'll leave it at that. We're going to get through this next section about how they buy fairly quickly. We next wanted to know what gains people's loyalty. And what we've looked at is a bunch of different statements. And what we found out in general is quality, transparency, authenticity, and price. For those of you who are taking notes in the audience, these are the 4 that you should write down. regardless of your demographic group, these are all critically important. Yes, there's variances. Where you see arrows through the presentation is where there is a statistically significant difference between that group and the other groups. But in general, quality is incredibly important. And it is even more important if you're a boomer. Transparency is also very high, maybe a little bit less for millennials, but still also important. Authenticity and price. We can't sacrifice any of these. When we look at other things, that doesn't matter as much. Greater good, giving to the world, is important, still above a 5, but not as important as the other factors. Certainly advertising. Heritage is interesting, and we'll talk about heritage in just one second, but lower statistically in millennials, and then social media. I want to tell a quick story about, and I'm being very cautious of time. I had an opportunity of having a conversation with the CMO of Harley-Davidson and presenting this information. And that individual was talking to me about a concept that happened a number of years ago when he came on board. And what they were finding is getting people into the Harley family at an early age was really important. And so what they wanted to do was develop a motorcycle that was at a lower price point that could get those people into the Harley lifestyle at an earlier age so that they would potentially grow up to be those hardcore Harleyites that that they know and love and to really define their brand. But to do that, they needed to take some of the product on there and make it a kind of a high technology pressed plastic, and still very stylish and still very branded and still very right. But they were excited about being able to drive the cost down a substantial percentage. And they put that in all of their showroom windows, and they were super excited about it. And the business results showed that it moved hardly a unit, according to the story that he was telling. And what they learned was that the Harley brand meant quality. And when you started pulling quality back from them, it no longer became a Harley. Younger people recognized that when it was time to buy the Harley was when they had enough money to be able to afford it. And until then, they were able to watch, nose pressed against the glass, and see all of those beautiful machinery there and know that it wasn't time. It wasn't about gaining access to something that wasn't authentically part of the brand. Not only was that devastating for the organization, but what was on the flip side of that was those people who were loyal Harley individuals saw that motorcycle as being plastic and toy-like, and it actually in some ways waned their perception of the organization. Their hardcore loyalists said, "Get that thing out of here, that's not a Harley." And immediately they came and they removed all of those products from their showrooms. I think it shows about the fact that if you are not competing on quality, transparency, authenticity, and price, you can't sacrifice those. And if you are not looking at those 4 metrics, regardless of your demographic group, as being absolutely critical, and your competitors are doing better at having those 4 traits aligned, you are going to find yourself at a disadvantage, if not today, very quickly. There are some other things which, if you download the presentation, we're going to kind of skip over these sections, but there are things that might make you change brands, things like financial situations shifting. And the one point that I will look at from this, and we talked about it with financial literacy, as much as parents tend to think that their millennials don't listen to them, millennials actually, for service-related organizations, look to their parents first and foremost as being experts in having made decisions related to like banking or financial institutions. I think about the millennials that I know, and they're certainly not talking to their friends about where they bank, or they're talking to their parents because they've lived it. And so strategies that banking organizations are now doing is having conversations with parents to say, here are the tools that you need to be able to have smart conversations with your millennials about banking and making smart financial decisions, and using the parents as a kind of a Trojan horse to get to that population in hopes that those relationships form, those branding relationships form. So we'll clip through a lot of this. There's one other point that I want to talk about here, and I think it's very important to this audience. What we ended up doing is then taking all that data we saw, quality, transparency, authenticity, and price as being the four. We're going to add a fifth to that, which is service. When looking at the numbers, these things had the greatest importance, but if you look across the bottom, you'll see that performance on general, our organizations doing well at delivering upon these things, you'll see that these are not doing very well in general. So not only are these five things very, very important, but in general, the perception is that most organizations are not doing them well. Let's talk about advertising on the far end. Most people are doing it, but it's not very important in the grand scheme of things. Creativity, very high in terms of importance and very high in performance. But they look at that as a point of entry. If you are not an organization that is thinking creatively and continuing to reinvent yourself creatively, you're not even in the consideration set. You're going to fall away quickly. Quality, transparency, price, authenticity, and service. I want to point out that this plotting is specifically for millennials. The plotting looks a little bit different for the other groups. We won't get into that today, but this is the most dramatic with millennials. One quick point, and I recognize that there's going to be people that are going to need to fall off, but I want to make one more point. I'm going to talk about Xers really quick. We Xers out there, be strong as I tell this story. We had a phenomenon that defined our millennial-esque time periods in our life, which was Old Navy. Our idea was to go and buy really inexpensive shirts that we wore maybe once or twice, wash them, and they would disintegrate. And we would just buy more. We would just keep buying more and more Old Navy t-shirts. And hopefully the Xers out there are smiling because they relate to that. I run an agency here that has, I would say, a vast majority being millennials. And they come in telling me stories of restaurants that they've eaten at that I know the bill at the end of the night was higher than any bill that I ever spent in my 20s. There is a gentleman here who wears a headphone set that is probably more expensive than anything outside of my home and my car in my house. Millennials' differences between Xers and Boomers are that they need a lot less in their lives, but the quality is much greater. They're willing to pay a lot more for quality things than to have a lot of stuff that have low quality. It's a different point of view. I still today find myself a little befuddled by it, but time and time proves it over again. So I'm going to get through this really quickly, and I'm going to do the quick takeaways, and I'm going to click through all five really quick. The important takeaway in all of this, like what does all of this mean, is really don't panic. If you don't understand, if you're trying to put strategies together and it's just not working, for those people who are Xers and Boomers, you went through it too, and really kind of get back to that young, someone once said the Boomers were hippies and the Xers were grungers. I'm not sure I was ever a grunger, but that idea of self-discovery and association is something very much natural with the life stage happening then, and you went through it too, most likely. Cynicism is not a categorically defining characteristic of a millennial. The better term is a realist. They just look at the world in a very real way. You need to let them drive and be in control. We didn't talk about this a lot, but the millennials will not allow you to control the dialogue. They need to be part of that. So the best way of helping millennials understand is helping to listen to what they have to say. So spending time and making sure that you're having conversations with millennials and then sharing back through your communications or through dialogue or through your website or through copy or whatever it is, the fact that you've talked with millennials, that you've spent time, that gets a lot of bonus points in their book. You can't fake it. If you're like, we're just going to take our price or our quality down and our price down a little bit, or our quality way down, and we're going to kind of fake it and make sure, they're going to be able to smell through that really, really quickly. And you run the risk of damaging your brand association. Well, at times, even in our Harley example, could choose to affect brand perception of other groups in other demographic groups who actually have absolute affinity towards you. You might see their affinity wane as well. 5, you need to be taking an honest look at your product or service and always be looking forward to feedback. I was talking with some veterinarians that gave this presentation, and they were like, we're on Yelp. And I said, are you having dialogue through Yelp, or are you just listening to what people are posting? And they're like, well, we listen to posting, and then We try to figure out who said it, and then we try to find them and have a conversation and then ask them to take it down. That's not a dialogue. That's borderline stalking. But the reality is they want to have a dialogue. They want to be engaged. They want to know that you're listening to feedback and reacting. And the more transparent you can be about that, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the better off you're going to be. And lastly, and the title of our presentation was, "They're nothing like us, they're exactly like us." The reality is I can point to as many situations as why millennials are very different than boomers or Xers, and I can point to just as many instances in which we're all very much the same. So I wouldn't necessarily call millennials aliens. I would definitely call them individuals that are distinct in their own way, just as boomers and Xers are in their own way. And more times than not, I think it's more accurate and more fair to lean towards the exactly like us than not. So hopefully today this gave you some things to think about as you can apply to employees that you have, for work colleagues that you have, and clients that you work with. The interesting thing about all of this is it's uniquely something that we all interact with. You don't avoid this group at all, and as this group becomes stronger in their buying and purchasing and have more disposable income, it's going to be more important to understand them than ever. With that, I know I'm a few minutes late. I appreciate everybody's time hanging on. I do have some time to stay and answer any questions that come out. I know we barreled through that quickly, so I will open it up to any questions.
Excellent, Michael. Well, thank you so much. I really took away some, I learned some things. This is great. It's really what I was looking to learn. So, well, people, as far as, audience questions, please type your questions in, go ahead, and we'll start asking some of Michael. And why don't I just start the ball rolling? Could you give us a couple more examples of how this really relates to veterinary practices? Especially if I'm an associate in a vet clinic, I work in a vet clinic, how can I take some of this and translate into what I should be doing to better serve my clients and increase business to my clinic?
Yeah, so I'm gonna start with something that has nothing to do with our research, but I think is really relevant. And there's a body of work out there that I'm really interested in as a business owner about the melting pot of employees. I mentioned that I have a vast, I lean much more towards millennials, so I don't have this tension that exists that a lot of organizations do, but this is an interesting point, which is if you look at historical business and you look at those three groups, and you look at corporate America to prove my point, and we'll get into veterinary medicine in a second. If my grandparents specifically, but if they worked at an organization for a really long time, they were there for their length of time at that organization is very long, right? And they, if they worked really hard at like 50 years or whatever, they were rewarded with a gold watch, right? That was like the big thing. And I think it's still willed to me when my father passes that I will get my grandfather's gold watch from the train organization that he was a conductor for. Absolutely. So there are those people that believe that if you work hard with the company and you're there and you around the clock and you bleed the company, it's almost like veterinarians in your alma maters, but that's a conversation for another day. That is just so part of who they are. Xers, stand by me with this one. We came up with this wonderful term called work-life balance. I want to work hard between 9 to 5, and I will focus there. But as soon as that minute clicks to 5 o'clock, I don't want anybody bothering me until the next morning at 9. Work-life balance. And then you've got millennials, and Libby, maybe you can vouch for this, who have a blending through their life, and so they might be responding to client requests at 2 in the morning when they come home from the bar. It causes me great amounts of stress as a business owner, but their life is so blended between their professional life and their work life. Oftentimes I hear conversations with millennials having conversations with Xers or boomers about why they didn't accept Facebook requests. The reality is the mindset of a working environment is very different than millennials with Xers and with boomers. And there is often conflict that exists. So for you practice owners out there, maybe you've seen this. Maybe you've seen your partner in the practice who's having a difficult time when a millennial is spending a lot of time on Facebook when they're not seeing patients. Or you've got an Xer who is like, I'm not putting in any more extra time, I worked hard now. It's just a different way of working. And what we've found is that transparency and helping groups understand the best ways of motivating other groups and why they behave and work the way they do, that understanding goes a long way. It certainly doesn't solve all your problems, but that's one point that I'll make. What is interesting about the conversations that I have found in general in talking with veterinarians, and I don't have the statistic numbers to back this up, but anecdotally, I believe that veterinarians in general, and I think probably human health too, are naturally conditioned to be risk adverse. And so in general, they are probably more realistic than the colleagues that I have here who are millennials who've gotten background in more liberal arts, art design, the risk for these guys is probably higher. So they are probably look at the world much more realistic, both the good and the bad. Having been associated with enough research relating to, and certainly are reflective of the next two sessions that you have on financial well-being and wellness, I think that veterinarians have a very real way of looking at their own individual situation with their debt, certainly their financial health as beyond their debt, and also their own well-being. And one of the things that I know that AVMA Life is working really hard to address is this idea of those things can be part of dialogue as you're having in your profession, whether or not you're a practice owner, whether or not you're a colleague. It's okay to have conversations and have really open and honest conversations about the experiences that you're having. I think naturally, to be a professional to the caliber of veterinary medicine, it's this idea that you've got everything figured out, and that if you say that I'm struggling with something or somebody acknowledges that, you're viewed as something weak. And I think what's interesting is this body of research has let us know that directionally with millennials, understanding that an acknowledgement and having a real honest and real look at a situation where there are challenges is absolutely what millennials gravitate towards, and probably even more so the veterinary millennials that exist out there.
That's really interesting. So do you think that, to follow up on that, do Xers or boomers have a more difficult time having those real conversations? Are we groups that, so I'm certainly an Xer, are these groups that maybe haven't been very practiced in that, so we don't exactly know, now that we understand that's maybe what we should be doing, it's up to us to kind of understand how to have those conversations? Or is that am I incorrect in that assumption?
I think it's a fair question. Two points we're now closely going away from anything that I can statistically back up, but anecdotally, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, both as it relates to the general population as well as veterinarians. And what I will say is, Xers and boomers have something naturally that millennials don't have, which is perspective and time. I in no way am taking away from the real feelings that millennials are going through. But what seems incredibly daunting at a moment, oftentimes with perspective, tends to be easier to be able to navigate. That is not meant to diminish the absolutely increasing debt that veterinarians face. Xers and certainly boomers did not have those financial pressures placed on them the way that millennials do. And I've often heard conversations, at times very tense conversations, in open focus groups. As I said, we've talked in open focus groups, not just in online surveys. I have seen the whites of the eyes of over 1,000 veterinarians in the last couple of years. I've spent a lot of time at, whether or not it's NAVC or Western or what they've rebranded. We can have conversations about that. But I found the most intense conversations between different demographic groups are boomers and Xers who are trying to explain that it's not so bad to millennials. Oh, it's not so bad. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. That's not the way of approaching the situation. It feels very real to millennials, and it is very real. It's very stressful. The data is telling us that. So a way of approaching that is first acknowledging that your experience is different. They're nothing like us, right? What you millennials are going through is a very different experience than what I went through when I was your age. So that's the acknowledgement that they're different. but also helping them understand that it's a real situation and that there are tools and services out there that can be utilized to help make you feel better and help make your situation better. So it's also an acknowledgement that you don't have to be weak. It's not a bad thing for you to seek help. And to be able to have the resources as an Xer or a boomer, almost like the financial service organizations are giving to parents. One veterinary student once said to me, I don't seek my parents' advice on veterinary medicine. They are not veterinarians. I seek mentors that I look to in my career, either in my practice or that I've met, whether or not that's school or whatever, and I seek those people's advice. Those people are the ones that are going to be the motivators to be able to say, you want to know, I'm not sure if you're struggling with this, but these are resources that I would turn to if when I was your age, I was challenged with these. I wasn't, and I acknowledge that what you're going through is very, very different, but if I would have gone through that, I would have loved to have known about these resources. So it's an acknowledgement that what millennials are going through in the profession is different than what the other groups have gone through, but also taking a real reality check and saying, and we see that this is a very real thing for you, and it's okay to seek help. You don't have to have the answers to all problems. Would be the things that I would point in.
Excellent, really helpful. Maybe do you have time for one more question, Michael?
Absolutely.
So a couple of folks, I see your Mac is going to fall asleep soon, so we'll catch you before that happens.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't worry, it's okay.
I might do this too.
No problem. A couple of folks asked about employees. So, two questions here that I think actually might be worth answering is, one, how do we treat millennial employees differently than millennial consumers? So when you're hiring an employee, you have employees there, how do you engage with them differently? And then the other question, which I thought was interesting too, is about price point. So there's a comment here from Jamie who says, she's a little bit, I'm interested in the price comment because I have clients that will literally buy a heartworm, my heartworm drug on Amazon if they can save $1, right? So when you're talking about price and quality, is it because, are they doing this because they can buy the exact same product from you, but okay, so it's the same product, we already know quality's been established, or, talk a little bit about those two things. So I realize I'm throwing two things at you here.
No, it's okay. I'll start with answering the second question first because it's most top of mind. I want to make sure, because we barreled through that section about price, authenticity, quality, service, that section. And not only do we need to make sure that we're performing well in all those areas, but we need to understand the connection between all four of them and that's communicated in that way. When you single out any of those, the table crashes down, right? So if I'm just constantly talking about price, like, well, we've got the cheapest price, eventually they're going to see through the fact that if the service isn't great and the quality isn't great and all, transparency and all that, then it's not going to work. If you start focusing on quality, but your pricing isn't where it needs to be, then that's not going to work. What you need to do is you need to have a well-rounded conversation about all of those items and help people understand that price is one thing that should be considered as part of this, but just like the example of the eyeglasses, we know that millennials understand that having a conversation when they're not the expert in something is important, and they're willing to pay more for that. But if they don't see the value that you bring, and I don't mean you bring in its totality, you bring on the decision point of whether or not I'm going to buy this for this or this for this. Essentially, the products are the same, and so we need to move the perception away from a commoditized decision to one in which you're not comparing this exact same product to this exact same product and this is cheaper, but the fact that the value you get from this has greater implications beyond the cost of that item. And you need to start looking at how that plays into the other things, the service that you're getting. Understanding that that there is a cost if everybody decides to shift all of their spending in pharmaceuticals to a digital thing. We're not going to be able to provide you with the type of quality and service. And, being that direct, maybe, you can have debates about whether or not you want to be that direct. The idea is, it's a little bit, I'm going to go off on a tangent for just a second and say, one of the struggles that AVMA struggles with is this idea of, well, I don't have to be a member of the AVMA because the AVMA is going to continue doing all the great things that they're doing that I benefit from anyways, advocacy, all this sort of stuff. So I don't have to pay the membership. Well, the reality is, if everybody has that mentality, then there's no money to be able to pay for that, and everything falls and everything becomes risky. And so part of it is helping paint a broader picture, and what often seems to be a transaction, I need you to pay more for this, gets away from this idea of a more holistic way of talking about the services you provide. And sometimes that is that there needs to be other things considered than any one of those 5 traits in its individual breakdown. Not sure if that's helpful. I might be oversimplifying, but in general, we often hear that conversation around price point, and it's rarely tied with the other features. The other question was relating to.
The other question is really about millennials who are employees.
Yeah. So I just hired a millennial recently, and one of my counterparts who is a boomer said to me, I don't think we should hire this specific person. And everybody else in the group thought this person was really great. She goes, I didn't even get a handwritten thank you note. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, is that not the pinnacle of understanding the difference between these different demographic groups? I'm not sure that millennial even has written a card out with a pen and paper and put a stamp on it, maybe ever. But that was really important to the boomer. I think the first is a recognition that it's okay to be different. And this whole idea, I think a lot of business owners, I know I've struggled with this, is that we need to treat everybody equal. Well, the reality is you can treat everybody equal if everybody from an attitudinal standpoint is the same. So if you literally have all boomers, we'll all be there with our Old Navy shirts on, and you can talk to us the same way. But the reality is what is differentiating with these groups is significant enough that you can't expect, if you've got a workforce that makes up even portions of these different demographic groups, that you can treat them all the same. And if you don't treat everybody the same, then that automatically is like, well, why is so-and-so getting to get out of here at 5 when I'm answering emails at 2 in the morning? Well, guess what? You're millennial. You're also checking Facebook. I can tell you, I can literally look at the numbers and sites where people are. I've known people who've tried to control millennials by turning off social media. You don't have access to social media. Millennials will leave your organization. They see everything as a complete blend. If you then say, okay, we're going to have a blended environment, everybody can do whatever they want. This is the trend that's happening right now in business where they're saying unlimited vacation days, right? We're just going to have an unlimited amount of vacation days. That is not going to fly with your boomers that are like, wait a second. I don't even use the vacation days that I have right now. I love this company, and I'm again, these are all kind of caricatures of these groups, but they're meant to prove a point, is that you can't, as a business owner, expect that everybody work the same if your workforce is so different. So the first thing you got to do is help everybody understand and acknowledge that different people in different groups have different needs, and that's okay. That Gen Xers are probably going to need to have a bit more flexibility than their counterparts because they have to make it to their kids' Christmas concert. And ultimately, millennial, that you might be resentful that they're not able to answer your calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, even though you know they're up because they're constantly talking about their kid that they're trying to deal with potty training. So they're up anyway. Why aren't they answering? Literally, that conversation has happened here in my office. The reality is it's a different mindset. And so acknowledgement is the first step that I would say.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, I appreciate you hanging on, everyone. I really appreciate you hanging on a little bit later here. And I think the Q&A was actually really helpful. So to add in some additional perspective, Michael, I appreciate it. And just to be, so thank you so much for speaking today. Again, I personally learned a lot. I'm really grateful. We have had similar, it's funny because we've had conversations here too about some of these topics. Like, for example, social media. Well, should we allow that during the workday? I don't know. And you know what? I think that you make a great point. I've never been a fan of, I'm not a fan of censorship. So there we go. No, probably says a lot about me too. All right. Well, we're going to wrap this up, everyone. Again, thanks so much for attending. This session will be recorded. If you want colleagues, friends to watch this, it will be accessible on the Pet Poison Helpline website within approximately 24 hours. It will also be accessible via the AVMA Life website too. So if you have additional questions, comments, certainly don't hesitate to reach out, and we can always get you in touch with Michael if need be. Thanks, everyone, so much. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.